Today we want to look at another occasion in Scripture where there is this ongoing conflict between the civil authorities, or the powers that be, and the people of God. And in this case, we're in the book of Exodus, and the story that we're talking about, of course, is the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt. The Exodus starts with the calling of Moses. Now, let's kind of unpackage that and say that in reality God knew for a long time that the people of Israel had been suffering. And in fact, we have in the book of Exodus that the background of the suffering of the people of Israel inside of Egypt is that there came to power a new regime. This regime historically was probably the overthrowing of the dynasty which was present at the time of Joseph. And there was a good relationship between Joseph, the people of Israel that he had brought with him, or his family that he had brought with him, and the Egyptian authorities at that time. But over time, a new regime came into power in Egypt, and this new regime, which is probably the remnants of the Hyksos takeover in Egypt, this new regime didn't know anything about Joseph. And so you had this large minority population, 500,000, 1 million people, that are living there inside of the nation of Egypt, which had limited resources, and basically their resources came during the flooding period along the Nile. And when you're a ruling class and you look out there and you see this large minority population or ethnic population, which were the Hebrews, and they are taking a lot of your resources, and you also are worried about the security of the nation, and you don't know anything about them because you don't have a prior relationship like the previous dynasty did, then certain things are going to happen. And one of those things that occurred was this new regime in Egypt, which was largely pagan and didn't know anything about the Hebrews. They were not monotheistic. They didn't share a common religion or anything like that. They became suspicious of this large ethnic minority. And whenever you have a large ethnic minority and suspicion, then they began to oppress them and force them into slavery, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon the situation for the Hebrews was not good. Well, this story has been told out not just at this particular time, but it's been told out throughout history, where you have one group of people oppressing another group of people. God's aware of that kind of suffering, and he's aware that there was suffering that was taking place by the people of Israel inside of Egypt, and he began to promulgate, to form a plan. And the plan was that the people of Israel needed to be set free, and they needed to return to a homeland which God had promised them, which they at one time had lived there. And they, for whatever reason, had found themselves for a long period of time comfortable in Egypt, making their life in Egypt, and it was part of the reason why persecution was allowed in the first place, was so the people of Israel would leave their comfort zone there in Egypt and go back to the land which God had promised them. Well, God's plan to set the people free is kicked into motion by really the activities of the Egyptians, where they begin to persecute and kill infants, especially boy infants, because of their awareness that there was some kind of a prophecy made that there would be a deliverer. And Moses was rescued by a princess, an Egyptian princess, out of the river Nile, and raised as a prince. And he was raised as a prince among the royal family, and God was preparing him, because Moses, more than any other Israeli, would know the inner workings of Egyptian hierarchy, of the power structure in Egypt. And so he was raised, he was put into a position where he had that particular insight. He also had the insight and was aware that the Israelis, the Hebrew people, were being persecuted, and in fact that led to him fleeing from Egypt and going to Midian, as we all know that story. And there in Midian, eventually having the encounter with God, and God calling him with his appearance, God's epiphany, or Moses' appearance before the burning bush. And we all know this story where God calls him at the burning bush and Moses comes back. Which brings me really to three questions. And those questions are kind of the center of what we're supposed to do when we live in a world where the culture around us has become largely corrupt, How do you respond as a believer? What do you do to disengage? And so today I have 3 questions for your groups. And the first question is this: when is it the right time to disengage from the predominant culture? And really, not only is when the right time, but how much do you disengage? If you don't have a country like the people of Israel had a country to go to, they could leave. Well, sometimes there are no options like that, and so you form an enclave? Do you completely separate yourself? What do you do to protect you and the body of believers from this culture, which is sometimes hostile and corrosive? Well, I think that's a good question. So that's question number 1. How do you disengage, and to what degree? Second question is this: how far do you go in disengaging? That's kind of part of that previous question. How far do you go in disengaging? As I said earlier, to what degree do you disengage? Do we disengage as believers? I'm a big believer in the idea that God never does anything twice, and so what He did with the people of Israel, the Hebrews, and calling them back, that's not likely to occur again. It might occur, I mean, who knows? But from my perspective, that's a pretty rare occasion where 500,000, 1 million people get up and leave one country and move to another country and establish that promised land. That was done especially just for the people of Israel. It's much more likely that instead of having a mass exodus, what you do is you build an enclave. And there are modern precedents for this kind of an approach. Some of those modern precedents would be like a Mennonite approach or an Amish approach, and I'm not sure I support that kind of an approach. But maybe more of an in-between approach where you do become something of an enclave, protect yourself from the corrosive culture or hostile culture, but yet provide a way to still stay connected so that you can bring others with you. And that brings me really to the third question. The third question is, how do believers witness in the midst of a disengaging process? Well, how do you maintain a witness in a corrupt culture when you don't want to be overcome by that culture? Well, I think that's a very important question because as believers, we're called to take our message to the whole world, and quite often the people we're trying to take our message to are hostile toward us. So how do you do that? How do you keep your witness in the midst of trying to disengage? So the 3 questions again: when is it the right time to disengage from a predominantly evil culture? How far do you go in disengaging as a believer? Do we try to maintain some kind of a contact? And third, how do believers witness in the midst of this process of disengaging from the prevailing culture? I think those are 3 really, really important questions, and probably a good place to kick off your small group discussions. Have a good day.